We're now going to start talking about Gothic art. And I want to start with a little introduction to Gothic. We're now going to start talking about Gothic art. And I want to give you an introduction to Gothic art, to explain some of the terminology, show you some of the characteristics of the architecture that you'll soon be seeing. So the first thing we want to define is, what is Gothic in this context? Gothic is of or relating to an architectural style prevalent in Western Europe from the 12th through the 15th century, sometimes a little bit into the 16th century in Northern Europe. It's characterized by pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, large windows, and an emphasis on verticality with the impression of height. Now, why call it Gothic? The Goths actually were Germanic tribes who moved into Italy and Western Europe in the 4th and the 5th centuries. You have the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. But that's the 4th and 5th centuries. Well, during the Renaissance in Italy, they looked back at this architectural style of the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. It really didn't live far into the 15th century in Italy. They didn't like it, actually. They thought that this architectural style was considered to be barbarous. In other words, it wasn't classical. It wasn't relating to ancient Greece and Rome. And indeed, Giorgio Vasari, in his Lives of the Artists, which was published in the mid-16th century, associated late medieval architecture with the barbarous Goths. So it's considered to be barbarian art, just horrible. They didn't know true classical, harmonious architecture. Well, we don't feel like that today. We like Gothic art, and I don't think anybody would call it barbarous. So if you ever run into the question of what do the Goths have to do with Gothic art, the answer is nothing. And in fact, I used to ask that as sort of a funny question. It was supposed to amuse people, I hope it did, on final exam in Art History 1. And I don't remember them now, but I came up with all sorts of complicated reasons that the Goths had something to do with Gothic. But the true answer was very simple. It was nothing. There were no Gothic tribes in the 12th century Europe. They had either died out or been assimilated into other peoples. Okay, so Gothic is a kind of pejorative misnomer. But it was used so frequently that we kept it. So when somebody says Gothic architecture, they probably don't think of the Goths today. They think of, beautiful cathedrals with glorious stained glass and pointed arches pointing up to heaven. So where does Gothic architecture really begin? And it begins with the architecture. Or Gothic art begins with the architecture. It begins, and it's very interesting because we can actually date where and when this new period begins. It begins in the Ile-de-France around 1140. Now, the Ile-de-France is the area around Paris. So it's just before the middle of the 12th century, about 1140. And the first Gothic structure is the remodeled choir of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, which then was near Paris. Now it's part of Paris. It's actually within the city limits of Paris today. From this area in Paris, from Saint-Denis, it expands. It's almost like ripples or concentric circles, and it expands outward to encompass pretty much all of Europe. Depending on the location, Gothic style lasts through the 14th century in Italy, which Italian Gothic usually has more walls than Northern European Gothic, and smaller windows, actually. And you can kind of understand that in a very hot climate, you might not want giant windows. Heat you up. And they also love to do fresco cycles in Italy, so you have to have walls for those. So the Gothic really begins in France and is not as popular. It doesn't last as long in Italy. But in Northern Europe, the Gothic style of architecture extends into the 15th and even in some places into the 16th century in Northern Europe. So, for example, I teach a course called Northern Renaissance Art, and it's some French, but primarily it's the lowlands and Germany often call the 15th and the early 16th century late Gothic. Spät Gothique in German. The Chapel of Henry VII in Westminster Abbey in London is actually early 16th century, but it's an example of the continuation of the Gothic style in architecture, even into what we really expect to be the Renaissance. And they definitely overlap. You can call them late Gothic, or you can call them Northern Renaissance. In fact, some places, Gothic was so popular in the 19th and even into the 20th century that there are Gothic-inspired buildings, something we call Gothic revivalism. We wouldn't call it, I guess, true Gothic. It's an imitation of the Gothic style in the modern era. But some examples of those are buildings that you may know. The Houses of Parliament in London. Westminster Palace was built in the 19th century. St. John the Divine in New York City. The National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. A number of universities are based on English perpendicular, this is the late Gothic style in England, English perpendicular Gothic. Princeton University, or my alma mater with my PhD, was Bryn Mawr College. And we had English perpendicular architecture. The University of Pittsburgh built a Gothic skyscraper, essentially, that's called the Cathedral of Learning. And even modern buildings can be influenced by Gothic architecture. Churches of all designs frequently include vertical elements or large stained glass windows. Architectural elements that even today suggest spirituality to many people. Now, when we think of Gothic cathedrals or Gothic churches, because they're not all cathedrals, we think of things like pointed arches, soaring upward toward heaven, pointing to heaven. Verticality, once again, reaching up toward heaven. And we think of colored light streaming through large stained glass windows. Some of the other characteristics would include ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and very frequently two-tower facades. So here you're looking at a picture of the nave of Chartres Cathedral, and you can see large stained glass windows, vertical elements, pointed arches, ribbed vaults. The flying buttresses, of course, are outside. But there is a detail showing you the large stained glass windows. And this is, I guess, become kind of a famous picture because you can also see the light shining on some of the stone areas coming from the windows on the other side. So that gives you kind of an idea of how the churches could have been illuminated with the stained glass windows. And of course, in many of the Gothic churches, these have been lost. They have been broken over the ages. I probably should also mention that churches, both Romanesque churches and Gothic churches, were painted very bright colors, most of whom have now, we see the stonework, which the paint is usually gone, but there are a few places where they have repainted them, and we'll see at least one of those later. Okay, now I use the term flying buttress. And probably a good idea for you to know what that is. So here's one of the definitions. And as you can see, a diagram showing, in this case, very elaborate flying buttresses. A flying buttress is a freestanding buttress attached to the church by an arch or half arch, which transmits the thrust of the vault to the buttress. So let me explain what that means and what you're seeing here. In this diagram, on the right, you're seeing the wall of the nave. And on the left, you're seeing, see all this stone or brickwork there. You're seeing this heavy buttress. Now, if you think about Romanesque churches, they generally just put the buttress right up against the wall. Think of St. Sernin in Toulouse. There are buttresses on the outside of the building, in other words, expanded masonry makes it thicker, wherever you would have the diaphragm arches or the transverse arches that would go across the nave. And so these are pushing in and helping to support not just the walls, but also because of the thrust, the way the weight is distributed in the vault. But in Romanesque churches, they'd be right against the wall. But here, they're distributed further out. So there's a kind of space between the buttress and the nave wall. And that's bridged by these curving forms. They said arches or half arches. And also pinnacles, masonry sections, which you see here, this little pointed section that adds more weight. But the thing is, because there's all this space that's air between them, they seem to be light. And they call them flying because, of course, with this curving form and the air between them, they remind people, I guess, of wings. They seem to soar. And the light can get in. The light isn't blocked by a buttress right up against the wall. The light can get in and can shine through those windows. So you're distributing the thrust of the vault or the weight of the vault in a different way. And here, you've seen a diagram, here's the details of some of the flying buttresses at Amiens Cathedral. And here, as you see, this is mostly 13th century church, so high Gothic, as we say. And you can see the buttresses here are so perforated. It's kind of amazing, that they perform their job admirably in holding up the church. But we can look right through and see the sky. And here on the left, you can see we're looking down at the top of these buttresses as they come out of the nave and cross over the side aisles. Now, many Gothic churches, particularly many Gothic cathedrals, have a two-tower facade, which you see here at Reims Cathedral, and very frequently a large rose window in the center. Now, the rose window is this circular window, and very frequently, of course, they would be filled with colored glass, stained glass, and the rose is associated with the Virgin Mary as well. You can see the pointed arches on the outside of the building, as well as, we saw them on the inside of another building. And there's the great deal of perforation and penetration. I mean, there's a few places where you can look through, and look at the towers on the right side of this, and you can actually see some sky through there. And you might notice that there's all sorts of decoration. Tracery, which is... I guess you could think of them as stone curlicues, but stone decoration. You have statues. And Reims is fairly unique that even over the doors they have round glass windows. You have a rose window there over the central door. Now, I mentioned Gothic cathedrals. We had Reims Cathedral and Chartres Cathedral. And I do want to remind you that not every big church is a cathedral. Cathedral doesn't mean big church. Cathedral means that it is the church of a bishop. And the word cathedra means seat or throne, or sometimes we say the see of the bishop. There may be an actual throne there for the bishop to sit on, or it may be more symbolic that this is his seat, the church itself. When you are identifying them in art history class, you can do it two ways. Generally, there's only one cathedral in a town. Not every town has a bishop, so not every town has a cathedral. But if it is a town that has a bishop, there is usually one church that is the bishop's church, the cathedral. There may be other churches, other parish churches, for example, or monastery churches in the town. But if you say the Cathedral of Reims, or Reims Cathedral, we know which church that is. Now, if you said the cathedral, you'd say, well, what town? There's probably thousands of cathedrals in the world. So you have to give both the word cathedral and the town. And there's another way you can identify it, by the dedication. Churches all have dedications. They are dedicated to a saint or a holy event. So they might be dedicated, for example, to the Virgin Mary, as this one is, or to, let's say the Assumption of the Virgin, a holy event. And so you can give the dedication. You can think of the dedication as the name of the church, but it's essentially the saint or event to which it's dedicated. So you can give the dedication or the name and the town. So if you were to say Notre Dame du Reims or Notre Dame at Reims, we would know which church it is because it is a cathedral, but a cathedral, of course, has a designation. It has a dedication. It has a name. And in this case, it is Notre Dame. Notre Dame is Our Lady. Now, that's French. Notre, Our, Dame, Lady. And you'll find that there are scores, maybe there are hundreds even, but there are many, many churches that are dedicated to Mary, the mother of Jesus, or they would say the mother of God. And she was, of course, especially venerated. If you go back to the beginnings, think about the Council of Ephesus in 431, where she is declared the Mother of God, and the veneration to Mary, grows. It is particularly strong in the 12th century onward. Mary is the chief intercessor. She has an in with God. After all, she's his mother, and one of her jobs is to intercede for mankind. It's kind of hard to go right up to God and say, hey, God, I want to talk to you. But, you have a woman who is tender-hearted and wants to save sinners. And so she could speak for you, say, at the Last Judgment. She can intervene. She is particularly venerated. And there are many churches in the Gothic period, and of course others earlier, but in the Gothic period there are just many, many churches that are named for Mary. In French, they are usually called Notre Dame, Our Lady. In German, Unsere liebe Frau, Our Beloved Lady. And it's the same meaning in Dutch or Flemish, Unsere liebe Frau. When you get to Italy or to Spain, it's usually Santa Maria. And it's often Santa Maria, of something. There's usually a designation, because you can't have more than one church in town dedicated to Mary. For example, in Florence, Italy, you've got Santa Maria dei Fiori. That's the cathedral, St. Mary of the Flowers. Santa Maria Nuovo. It has a hospital attached to it, actually. I think it's a convent. And you have Santa Maria Novella, which is a Dominican monastery church. And you have Santa Maria del Carmine, which is the Carmelite church. So, there are a lot of different St. Marys in Florence, and in some other towns there's more than one. But generally, when we're talking about this in class, and you're talking about Notre Dame du Chartres, which you see here in the picture, so this aerial view of Notre Dame, or the cathedral at Chartres, and we'll refer to them, both as Notre Dame and as the cathedral. Or you could say Notre Dame du Paris, Our Lady of Paris. And, a lot of people say that. They'll say Notre Dame and expect you to know which church they mean. Well, how can you possibly know? Well, they're probably thinking of the one in Paris. But it's not the only Notre Dame in France or in the world. And it is the Cathedral of Paris. We'll be seeing that later on. So let's go back and remind you of the first Gothic structure. That's always a good question to ask on the exams. What's the first Gothic building or first Gothic structure? Where does the Gothic begin? Well, the Church of Saint-Denis. This is the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis. In other words, it's a monastery church. It's an abbey. The head of it is an abbot. His name is Abbot Suger. And it's a royal abbey because it has had royal patronage for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't know if you remember, but back in the Carolingian period, in the 9th century, Charles the Bald, the emperor, Charlemagne's grandson, was the lay abbot of Saint-Denis. Now, by the 12th century, they don't have lay abbots, but it has royal connections. Many, I want to say most, of the royalty of Paris was buried in this church. And of course, many of those tombs were despoiled during the French Revolution, and then later they, gathered up what bones they could find. They didn't know whose bones they were, so they sort of walled them up in what would have been probably a chapel, and have a plaque on the front of them. So what survives is there, but not as well designated by who is who. But going back to the 12th century, this church had been around for a long time. It had certainly been around since the Carolingian period of the 9th century. They've been, I'm sure, rebuilding as they go, changing things. They have done some excavations under it and discovered some of the Carolingian foundations and things. But Abbot Suger wanted to remodel it, to have it rebuilt. And so they did, starting with the choir. And the choir, we've talked about apses before, but the choir is what would be the apse, plus all of the chapels that surround it. So they've gotten much larger. It's called the choir because that's where the choir of monks would sit. And here we're looking into the ambulatory, or the way to walk around. And you can see all of these stained glass windows, and you can see that there are altars, probably some reliquaries there, little chapels there. We'll talk more about that later. So he is the patron of the Gothic style, essentially. One of the things to tell you how important he was, he's not a bishop, he's an abbot, but it's a royal abbey. And he is so important to the royalty of France that when the king, Louis VII, goes on crusade, goes on the Second Crusade, all the way to the Holy Land, who is he going to appoint as regent? Who's going to run the country in his stead? If he gives that power to a duke or some other aristocrat, he may come back and find out his kingdom has been stolen. The duke might get too full of himself and decide that he should be the king. So who becomes the regent of France? He can't leave it with Eleanor of Aquitaine, his wife, because she goes on crusade with him too. But the regent that he names is Abbot Suger. Now he knows that an abbot, as a churchman, can't steal his throne from him. Not just because of the goodness of his heart, but because you're not allowed to be an abbot. You can't inherit the secular property. And so that is the person that he thinks has the administrative ability to run the entire country for 2 years while the king is away on crusade. Abbot Suger. We'll hear more about him. You'll probably be reading some excerpts, at least little excerpts, maybe if you want to. I have more information about him on the website under supplemental readings, and also Fordham University has a copy translation of his writings. He describes this. Now, one of the things that's really useful is, why do we bother to have a whole different period? We talk about Romanesque architecture, which is a name that was made up to talk about a particular, actually very heterogeneous style of architecture. There's a lot of variation in it. Romanesque architecture. And then Gothic architecture is probably more homogeneous. There's more similarities, particularly the French Gothic architecture. So we want to contrast this. So I made up a little chart. I like charts to show you the differences. And then I'll show you some examples. With Romanesque architecture, and remember we said this about Ottonian architecture as well, you have a very clear articulation of parts, or separation of parts. Your exterior church can kind of look like, okay, here I can see every part very separately. In some places, say like Legos or building blocks or something. With Gothic architecture, you may have all these parts, but they seem to be unified. And it's very complex. And part of that unification, I showed you a few minutes ago, the facade of Reims Cathedral. It's so covered with decoration and sculpture and tracery and all this decorative form that it might be hard to you see the whole thing as a whole. It might be hard to pick out every single little part. And we'll also look at this in relationship to the plans as well. Now, Romanesque architecture has been called an architecture of walls because they have heavy, massive walls to support those masonry vaults, whether they are tunnel vaults or groin vaults or even domes in Aquitaine. It's heavy walls, and of course small windows in those heavy walls. In Gothic architecture, they've learned ways to support the buildings without those heavy walls. We talked about the flying buttress for one. And the walls become perforated or open. In other words, you've got more opening maybe than walls sometimes, but it certainly gives the feeling of being, open. It's sometimes said that the Gothic is the architecture of supports, rather than solid walls, these supports, and it appears to be light. I one time said to somebody it was light, and they said, "What do you mean? It's all made of stone." Of course it's not really light weight, but it gives you that feeling. And, of course, light penetrates through those openings and penetrates through those stained glass windows. Now, when we look at Toulouse, and there are some windows in those churches. There's some in the apse or the choir, the eastern end, the altar end, the main altar end. And there's some in the side aisles and the galleries. But when you're looking at the nave, there's no clerestory. They've got arcade, a gallery, and no clerestory. Now, there are some Romanesque churches that have clerestories, particularly, we'll talk about, in Burgundy, say, Cluny 3, or Saint-Lazare, the Cathedral of Autun. And they have a clerestory. But compared to the Gothic clerestories, you have a lot of wall and a smaller window. Smaller clerestory. So in Gothic architecture, the walls are open up. They may fill the entire space between the supports in a large clerestory. And other places, in the aisles, more windows in the east, maybe windows in the west, and so it allows in light. So light, we said light in the sense of it feels lightweight, although it isn't, but it also feels light in the sense of completely filled with light, which is a kind of representation of what light is sometimes seen as a symbol of the divine. Spirituality is not something that you can physically grab and hold. It goes through windows without breaking them. Analogous to the virgin birth of Christ in the virginal womb of Mary, actually, as some late medieval hymns will say. But penetrating through light, it seems to have an aesthetic and spiritual interpretation of it. Okay, so let me just show you some examples here. I'm trying to remember, but let me show you some pictures so you can remember. Articulation, the architecture of walls. We have here on the left Toulouse, St. Sernin. Maybe you can make it out when you look at it. You know exactly what the parts are. You've got a sort of a large western end, a whole separate roof there. And then the nave is very high. You've got two side aisles come down. The cruciform plan is very clear, and each little chapel that comes off the apse is a separate cylinder. You can see that. I don't know if you can make it out in the picture, but you have these buttresses that are, every bay is marked by the buttress with little small windows and just very thick walls. And we go over here and look at Notre Dame du Paris, or the Cathedral of Paris. Well, yeah, you can make out what the parts are. It also has a kind of cruciform plan and everything, but you've got all those flying buttresses, which make it hard for you even to see the eastern end. Yeah, they got big windows, and the light can get into them, but you almost have this feeling of supports, and since they're all the exterior is all covered up with all the decoration and the flying buttresses, and of course you have the opening of the rose window that you can see. It becomes you're not looking at the little parts so much as you're looking at the whole thing. That feeling of unity. You can also see that when you look at the plans, and here I show you a plan of the Romanesque Church of Santiago de Compostela, which very, very clearly, every little chapel is separate. And you can see the chapels that go around the apse end, the choir now, because it's enlarged, are very clearly separate entities. They look like little U's, kind of upside down on the plan. And you have the echelon chapels, the chapels that are parallel to the nave that come off of the transept. Everything's separate, little modules. When you look at Rheims Cathedral, yes, we said, it's kind of cruciform, but it's like the crossbar has been absorbed into this huge choir. And then if you look at the chapels in the choir, they share walls. They're not completely separate. The wall of one is the wall of the next one. So there's a kind of unity between them. Yeah. And here we bring you Saint Stephen, Saint Etienne in Cannes. And you have the two-tower facade, although those towers get built somewhat later too. And you can see lots of very heavy buttresses in the front. And the walls are perforated, but a lot of wall there, and smaller windows. And also that idea of the two-tower facade we'll talk about. Same thing with Rheims. The opposite thing with Rheims, where you have the perforations literally opening, large windows, large open spaces, and if it's not open, it's covered with sculpture or has a huge stained glass window, such as the Great Rose. And then even in this case, which is not typical, but it's a unique feature of Rheims, you have the second rose in the where you would expect a tympanum to be over the doorway. Lots of perforations, lots of large windows. We talked about the equalization of horizontal and vertical and the idea of verticality. And if we're looking here at Santiago, we could have also used St. Sernin or some other church as an example. You do have vertical elements. You have these colonnettes that rise up to the springing of the vault. And then the transverse arches, curve around. I don't want to say they're completely horizontal, but they curve around from one side to the other. You also have a very strong string course that divides the gallery level from the arcade level, the bottom level and the top level, essentially. Of course, we had said we have no clerestory here. When you look at Chartres Cathedral, and one of my students actually took this photograph for me, and he's using a special lens which exaggerates perhaps it almost looks like the figure the building is narrowing with perspective. It doesn't quite look that much like that, but he wanted to get the whole bay. We've got two bays here in, and you can get the feeling certainly of verticality. The colonnettes, you can see that you have a compound column here, sort of hiding the weight of the pier that supports the arcade, and then you have all of these smaller colonnettes rising up. You have pointed arches as opposed to the rounded arches at Santiago, and you have a triforium. A small area with just enough space for maybe a workman to get back there if they have to get up there, but not really a place for people to stand. But it gives you the feeling it's perforated. There's a wall back there, but it's a perforation. And it's much smaller than the gallery level where people can stand up there, and it's a whole second story, as it were, in Santiago. And then, of course, you have these huge stained glass windows, once again, pointed arches pointing up toward heaven, and just the whole feeling of verticality. And we mentioned at St. Cyrenan, and we mentioned at Santiago, and of course it's almost look-alike church of St. Cyrenan, although St. Cyrenan has double side aisles. But we see that there's no clerestory. There are small windows in the aisles, but all that light would have to get through the aisle to get to the nave. Well, the nave was brightly colored once. It's not now, but once. It still would have been dimmer in the nave. In Chartres, Notre Dame du Chartres, or Chartres Cathedral, as you can see, we have the very large stained glass windows that shed light and color, and they are the clerestory windows. So they're shining this into the nave. We talk about unity. I repeat myself because some things are characteristic of several of these characteristics. Stained glass windows. This particular picture shows the Lady Chapel, or the easternmost chapel. It's dedicated to Mary at Amiens Cathedral. And as you can see, the walls are pretty much stained glass window. You've got a little wall at the bottom, but up above, just huge windows. The color light unifies the interior of the building. And, light can kind of fool you. It can de-emphasize the structure. Everything is light and color. And, where are those posts? So that idea of Gothic unity. You also have things like the multiplication of the colonnettes. And the pilasters on the compound piers sort of hide the fact that you have this heavy element with a lot of these more slender elements. And then the colonnettes, you have this little bunch of very thin columns, colonnettes we call them, rising up to the springing of the vault. And here we see them at Amiens. Katzenellenbogen called them energy spouts because you have more and more the higher you go. They've also been called a reverse waterfall, because we have more and more of these vertical elements. But they tie the church together. And here we are looking at that plan again, the idea of the radiating. This is a plan of Amiens Cathedral, where the radiating chapels share the walls. They flow into one another. You can find the transept, but it's only one bay different than the width of the building itself. So it's sort of been, the transept seems to have been absorbed into the building. We mentioned this before, that the decoration obscures the parts. I think you can find parts, but they're all covered up with tracery, with the sculpture, with the all sorts of other decorations. So it's you don't immediately say, oh yeah, I see all the building blocks of the church. more difficult to separate the structural elements. And that also is Amiens Cathedral right there. Now, one other thing I want to make clear, because I find this fascinating. You know, we talk about Gothic architecture as this new architectural style, and it is. But the elements don't spring from nowhere. We can usually find in different Romanesque buildings the beginnings of these elements that, you know, become Gothic. They're developed further and they become Gothic, and you put them all together and they become what we call Gothic. So, for example, you have two-tower facades sometimes in the Romanesque era, not always, but here in Normandy and Caen, we have, you know, that idea of the two-tower facade. The pointed arch is introduced in Burgundy in the Romanesque period, both at Cluny 3, St. Peter and Paul, actually, Cluny 3, and you can see the pointed arches in the nave arcade, and possibly, we think, slightly pointed in the vault. It's been torn down, except for one transept, so a little hard to tell. And then Saint-Lazare at Autun, another Burgundian church, kind of imitates the Cluniac style, and you have the pointed arch in the arcade. You can see the rounded arch up above, and also you can see what I was talking about, where you have a little clerestory window with very thick wall. If this were a Gothic church, the window would fill the entire space of the clerestory between the supports. And even what looks like a little transept, a little triforium, and essentially, I guess, serves the same thing. You could call it a triforium, but it's really a blind arcade with just one perforation. So lots of wall. We said that in some of the Norman churches, and also San Ambrogio in Milan, you see ribbed vaults. We call them early ribbed vaults. They're ribbed vaults before there was Gothic. As we say, the sexpartite vault in Caen, and the ribs are this sort of masonry diagonals, you know, that crisscross the ceilings, at the edge of the groins. They're moldings; they actually stick out, and they are very much part of the structure of the building. And here we see them at Durham Cathedral in northern England. Incidentally, that rose window down at the apse end of Durham is Gothic. Some churches are part one style and part another. Others, they remodel, they build on. So they have a Gothic parts to Durham Cathedral. But the nave is Romanesque. Now, a lot of times I'm throwing around, it seems to the students, architectural terminology. They say, what the heck does she mean by a triforium or a spandrel or something like that? Well, a good place to go for a definition of medieval art and architecture is the website of the University of Pittsburgh. And they have an online medieval art glossary. And you have there the Earl. And here is a kind of a cutaway diagram. It's based on Amiens Cathedral with, as you can see, some of these terms that we've talked about. The ribs are pointed out to you, diagonal ribs. They said transverse ribs, or we have said transverse arches. You can see the flying buttresses. Some of this is cropped, but that little pointed part on the far left is called a pinnacle. And then we've talked about the heavy buttress linked by the flying buttress. The pier, the major support of the nave arcade. Up above the arches, you know, sort of you might think of the sort of the corner up there. It's called a spandrel. And the triforium is a smaller perforated place between the arcade and the clerestory. The clerestory, of course, is the top window level. So, it's easier sometimes just to see them in a diagram. Let me show you some of these and give you some of the definitions. We're looking here up into the vault of Amiens Cathedral, and it's what we call a four-part vault, quadripartite. But you can see the ribs. And the ribs, that's a definition, a rib is an arch of masonry, often molded. In other words, having a design, a molding that makes it stick out, which forms part of the framework on which a vault rests. Asher would build the ribs and the arches first, and then they would fill in the webbing or the ceiling after, rests on these. A rib vault, or a ribbed vault, is a masonry vault with a relatively thin web, or the ceiling, which is set between a framework of ribs, which you see there. Clerestory, well, you know this term because we've had this ever since early Christian art. The clerestory is the upper story of a building when you have, say, the windows above the adjacent roofs, in other words, the side aisle roofs. Or, it's easier just to think of this way, the top level, or the top window level of a church nave. And of course, not all churches have clerestories, but certainly they are extremely frequent in Gothic art. The triforium is, if you have a three-part vault, a three-part elevation, in other words, you're looking at the nave of a Gothic church. There are some exceptions, but most of them will have the arcade, and then a triforium, and then a large clerestory. And so you have this narrow, perforated section in the thickness of the wall, of the nave wall. And the arches, you can see, look into the nave. They're open into the nave. You can see in the detail here, there is wall behind it, but there's a little passage. But it's a narrow passage. People aren't supposed to get up there and watch the church services from there, as whole crowds, like in a gallery. A gallery is much larger, and the triforium is much smaller. And if you have a three-story Gothic church, it's usually the second layer. There are, of course, some exceptions. For example, at Notre Dame, at Léon, which is an early Gothic church, they were doing a lot of experiments during the early Gothic period. They have a four-layer church, and they have an arcade, a gallery, and then you can see much smaller than the gallery, the triforium, and then the clerestory. The rose window, we've already talked to you about that. It's a circular window, a round window, and it has this patterned tracery. The tracery here is made out of stone, and those are the decorative stone elements. And they say arranged in a petal-like formation, so that's why it's a rose. And the example I'm showing you is from the north side of the north transept of Paris, the Church of Notre Dame du Paris, or the Cathedral of Paris, from the outside and from the inside. And here we talk about tracery. Tracery is this ornamental work with interlaced and branching lines. They're usually stone. You can have, of course, wooden tracery. I suppose you could also have tracery when it's drawn as well. We're particularly talking about it is the lacy open work of a Gothic window. So I think this is Amiens at the top, and I think it's one of the English churches at the bottom. Okay, doorways also have some terminology. The trumeau is the doorpost between the two doors, and they usually are decorated with either carvings or statues. And then the jambs are the vertical posts or columns on both sides of the doorway, the opening. or of a window, but here we're talking about a doorway. And you can see in this diagram they're showing them with little statues, and of course we see this very frequently in Gothic period, that they have these many door jambs. And then of course up above you have the arch of the tympana, and many archivolts, forming a very deep framework all around it. And very often those door jambs are decorated with statuary. And we'll see the evolution of the Gothic figures on the door jambs as we explore the Gothic architecture.